Dive into the darkest depths of Route 66 as we unravel two chilling tales of the supernatural. From the mysterious Black Ford to the cursed diner, prepare to be captivated by these eerie stories. If you're a horror fan, this is the channel for you. Subscribe now and join the horror community. Arizona that day looked like dried out skin, cracked, taut, and ready to burst from the heat. Route 66 stretched out like a depleted artery across the lifeless desert, and my motel, Graston Rock, was the last outpost of civilization before the endless nothingness. My name's Frank Holloway, 52 years old, and I've owned this dump for the past 15 years. Ex-military mechanic who traded in his uniform for a worn-out leather jacket and ripped jeans. My face is etched with deep lines that tell a story of too much sun, too much booze, and too many lonely nights. That afternoon, Johnny Cash was crooning on the radio, his Ghost Riders in the Sky, somehow perfectly fitting the mood. Quiet, tense, like it was foreshadowing something to come. I was just wiping down the bar, an old, worn piece of furniture that had heard 1,000 stories, when the door burst open. She ran in, a girl, maybe 20, looked like she'd just escaped her own personal nightmare. Her white t-shirt was dusty, her hair a tangled mess, and she was slick with sweat. But what really hit me were her eyes. They were the eyes of someone who had just seen something a human shouldn't. She stared right through me, but she clearly wasn't here. She was somewhere else. Water, she whispered, her voice so weak I barely heard it. I moved slowly towards her, like I didn't want to scare her. Old habit from my military days. Approach the scared ones cautiously. Easy, I said, offering her a glass. Sit down. Her hand shook so bad I had to steady the glass. A few drops spilled onto the counter, leaving tiny, fleeting trails that quickly disappeared. Just like her thoughts seemed to be. What happened to you? I asked, trying to sound calm, even though inside I was as hot as this desert asphalt. And that's when she started her story. A story that would change everything we thought we knew about Route 66. I listened intently, clutching my coffee mug so tightly that my fingers were turning red. I sat behind the bar, and Sarah was on a stool that was sinking on one side, just like this whole motel. The car was old, Frank, she began, a Ford from another time. Black as night, shiny as a mirror, but somehow different. I looked at her. I knew the story wasn't over. She continued, when the car door opened, I didn't think twice. I was tired, thirsty, and I just wanted to get to a safe place. Between me and the driver was glass, black, opaque, like I was in some kind of sealed chamber. I pushed the coffee mug closer to her. Her hand trembled as she took it. The driver didn't say a word. Complete silence. Just the sound of the engine and the hum of the air conditioner. The desert was burning outside, and I felt like I was in some weird, frozen moment. I glanced at the window. Outside, the desert was shimmering like a fiery ocean, and the shadows were growing longer. When we got close to the rest stop, I said, "This is where I get off," Sarah continued. And the car stopped. Just like that. She paused. She looked me straight in the eye. And then, her voice grew quieter. I tried to open the door. The door wouldn't open. I wanted to ask her something, but I couldn't. Something told me the story was just beginning. I tried pulling the handle, Sarah continued, but the door was locked tight. Like it was trapped by some other, invisible force. I set down my cup. The coffee left a stain on the worn counter, just like stories sometimes left marks on our memories. And then something strange happened. Her voice turned into a whisper. The glass between me and the driver slowly started to open. I leaned forward sharply. Sarah was trembling, her fingers gripping the mug unsteadily. First, I only saw a shadow, pale, almost transparent, and then she paused, swallowing hard. Then I saw the face. I let her continue. I knew the story needed its moment. A young man, with gray hair. But not how a young man would look. His skin was pale, almost as white as flour. And his eyes. She paused. His eyes? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. They were completely black, she whispered. Like two black stones instead of eyes. A silence fell over the motel so thick I could hear a fly buzzing against the dusty window. I couldn't take my eyes off Sarah's face. I knew the story she was telling wasn't just a simple trip or coincidence. In my line of work, after so many years on Route 66, I'd learned to recognize stories that carried something more than just a journey. I tried to scream, she continued, but my voice got stuck in my throat. The driver didn't look away. Those black eyes, Frank. They were like two deep holes without a bottom. I nodded, encouraging her to go on. And then the worst thing happened. Sarah gripped her mug so tightly her knuckles turned white. I tried to touch the handle, to move the door, but I couldn't. It was like they were trapped by some invisible force. The desert outside was shimmering, and the shadows were growing longer. And then, her voice grew soft, almost a whisper. The glass opened completely. I screamed, Frank. I couldn't help myself. The sound just came out of me. She paused, trying to catch her breath. I pulled the door handle. At first, it wouldn't open, and then, somehow, it opened on its own. I jumped out of the car and ran as fast as I could. For a moment, I pictured the scene. Sarah, alone on the desert asphalt, surrounded by the burning heat, running from something that was neither human nor explainable. When I reached the rest stop, I felt like my lungs were on fire. I didn't look back, I couldn't. I just kept running until I was inside. Her voice trailed off, and I could hear the old wall clock ticking behind the bar. I had never heard anything so eerie. 18 years have passed since that day. I've never seen Sarah again. She vanished, just like so many things in this part of the world, quickly, quietly, and without a trace. Yet, I've never forgotten her. Every now and then, I think of her eyes, those black eyes of that young man in the black Ford. Was it just her imagination? Something conjured up in that moment of fear? Or was it real? Did she ever see him again? Or did she, like me, remain with a question that never got answered? I'll never know. And to be honest, I don't know if I want to. Maybe it's better to leave it in the darkness, with all the other misfortunes people experience on Route 66. Because sometimes I think it might be dangerous to seek answers to certain questions. My name's James Jim Hawkins, and I've been a waiter at the Midnight Diner on Old Route 66 for a solid 7 years. It's a place where travelers often stop for a quick break, a cup of coffee, or just to escape the world. Out in the middle of the desert, our little diner was a place where everyone stopped, tired from the long journey. But what happened that night had nothing to do with the peaceful life on Route 66. It was a hot, sweltering night. The sky was red, and the wind carried the smell of dust and gasoline. I had the last cup of coffee on the counter as I slowly wiped down the bar, occasionally glancing out the diner windows. No one had been in for a while, and the night seemed like any other. I've never believed in premonitions, but that day everything was somehow quiet, stuffy. Like something was brewing, but you don't know what. Suddenly, I heard the roar of a powerful engine approaching at high speed. A black Ford, with one powerful blow, smashed through the diner doors. The screeching metal, shattering glass, and the crashes that followed left me paralyzed. Everything turned into chaos in an instant. The old car crashed straight into the counter, smashing tables, overturning chairs, until it stopped in the middle of the diner. Exhaust fumes filled the room. Although I knew something serious had happened, nothing could prepare me for the sight before me. Around me, all the objects in the diner, old tables, lamps, porcelain cups, were scattered, destroyed. I could smell burnt gasoline and metal, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with horror. The black Ford had simply destroyed the diner. Without warning, without any reason. Official papers were flying, glass was shattering, and the walls were cracking under the weight of the impact. Fire suddenly erupted from the chaos the black Ford had caused. It was the cause of complete chaos, but the Ford stood untouched, as if nothing that had happened around it had anything to do with it. Inside, the diner was completely destroyed. Flames devoured the wooden beams. The crackling of the glass was like thunder. Everything collapsed under the weight of the explosion. I was waking up from my confusion when I saw smoke coming through the doors and windows. The fire was everywhere, fast, merciless. But what completely paralyzed me was the sight of the driver of that black Ford. He sat in his vehicle, motionless, as if completely indifferent to everything happening around him. There was no expression in his eyes, nothing to indicate panic, nothing that would match the terrible chaos he had caused. I stood there at that moment, superfluous in a world that was collapsing, overwhelmed by panic and fear, looking at that car. There were no signs that the driver wanted to get out. The car was surrounded by flames, smoke, but the driver remained completely uninterested in everything that was happening. The flames were spreading, devouring everything in their path, and the diner was looking more and more like an apocalypse. The driver still didn't get out of the car, sitting quietly, as if he knew nothing bad could happen to him. Maybe for him all this was some kind of game, something he had to provoke. The flames continued to devour everything around him, but that black car was like a beacon in the darkness, although the light it emitted was only from the fire that was destroying everything. I felt that there was more to it. This wasn't just an ordinary accident. Someone had deliberately caused all this, and that someone was still sitting in his black Ford, not moving an inch. As the emergency services arrived, with sirens echoing through the smoke, the driver of the black Ford suddenly started the engine. The sound that came from the engine was deep, as if the Ford itself was waking up from its silence. In the moment the engine roared, the driver turned the wheel, although there was no trace of haste. He didn't look left or right. He just drove towards the exit. The smoke from the fire was still thick, but he drove through it, unscathed, as if nothing could harm him. At that moment, the diner doors opened. Paramedics, firefighters, and police entered the premises, but it was too late. The Ford was gone, as if it had never been there. No one could explain what had actually happened. No traces led to the driver. He was just there and then gone. The services failed to find any answers, and what was most confusing was that people started talking about the black Ford long before it came to this particular location. Stories about that car had been circulating on Route 66 for years, like evil stories spreading among travelers and workers who passed that way. The black Ford was present in stories of mysterious disappearances, strange accidents, and people who would appear and disappear without a trace. An investigation was launched, of course. The FBI soon took over the case, requesting all data on that car. However, the results were scarce. No one could connect the Ford to real people. No trace led to the driver. No one knew who was in it, or what exactly he wanted. The investigation ended without answers, but the stories about the black Ford never disappeared from Route 66.